This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. I'm your host, Gidon Bromberg.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dahlia Shenlin.
If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom of the page and click the big red button that says Patreon. We're counting on you. Every week, Dahlia and I bring you interviews with authors on books, research, and other essential topical issues. This episode is sponsored by the German government. Germany will be holding the EU presidency in the second half of 2020, and with their generous support, the Tel Aviv Review will be holding a series examining Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries.
Our guest today is the leading figure in the region in cross-border environmental policy and activism, something that we don't actually cover on the show nearly as much as we should. Gidon Bromberg is the founder and 25-year co-director of EcoPeace, a trilateral organization that brings together Jordanian, Palestinian, and Israeli environmentalists. Gidon has written extensively on the relationship between water issues and Middle East peace and has presented before the UN Security Council, the UN Climate Summit, the U.S. Congress, the European Parliament, and other international forums. Gidon is an attorney by profession. He's an alumni of Monash University in Australia, Washington College of Law at American University, and Yale University's World Fellows Program. We'll be discussing some of EcoPeace's major policy reports, including climate change, water security, and national security for Jordan, Palestine, and Israel from 2019, another report called the Water Energy Nexus from 2017, and other publications. In essence, you have a global expert on the show. Gidon Bromberg, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dahlia and Gilad. A real pleasure to be on the show.
Great. You know, in order to discuss these issues, I want to get into one of the main principles that I think inform your work, and this is kind of the global aspect in terms of how you address climate change overall. In the EcoPeace report from 2019, you make the point that actually it's not totally climate change itself that threatens our societies, but the ability of governments in this region, anywhere in the world, to adapt their societies through policy. Or the inability to adapt. And that's what you call adaptive capacity. Can you explain what this means? Because I feel like this has everything to do with what EcoPeace does in terms of trying to reframe policy.
So spot on. Firstly, the climate is changing. The climate has changed, has always changed. But today we have verifiable scientific evidence by 99% of the world's scientists in agreement that the climate change and the climate crisis that we see taking place today is due to human intervention. And given the size and the level of intervention, the ability of a country and of the world as a whole to maintain the type of livelihood, the type of societies that we would like to maintain is very much dependent on our ability to on the one hand, mitigate, to reduce the impact of ourselves on the climate and the changing climate, and on the other hand, to adapt to the changes taking place. And given that Israel, Jordan, Palestine are not in any way the main contributors to the climate crisis, we first and foremost need to work together, and that's really at the forefront of our rationale. We need to work together to adapt to the dramatically changing climate. And what does that mean? It means that in the last 20 years, apart from this last winter, which was extraordinary, we've seen 15 years of drought in our region. Our region is already the most water scarce part of the world. The Middle East and North Africa. There's no other part in the planet. There's no other area in the planet that has less water per capita than the MENA, the Middle East, North Africa region. So we're already an incredibly water scarce part of the world. And we're seeing, because of human-induced climate change, a dramatic reduction in precipitation. The rest of the world is really worried about a 1.5, perhaps 2 degree increase in temperatures. We're already experiencing a 2 degree increase in temperature on average over this last 100 years.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask you, so you're saying basically we didn't do it, but we are the ones suffering for it the most, and we have to fix it. But what I'm really interested in is your use of the term we. Who is the we that EcoPeace expresses?
Let me rephrase that and say that, despite the MENA region has bigger problems, as you say, than many other parts of the world, but it's not just that. And there are two main obstacles when you come to think about geopolitics in the Middle East. One of them is that many governments have bigger fish to fry than climate change. I'm thinking predominantly about Syria. Yeah, they have more. Well, not more urgent, but equally urgent and perhaps other things to worry about. And the other thing is that climate change action requires cross-border cooperation, which is something that, let me say gently, the Middle East hasn't excelled at.
So we have like 7,000 questions for you, basically.
Well, that's perfect because that actually brings home the point as to why the work of EcoPeace is so essential. Because the mindset of the governments in the region is that, no, we can go it alone. Unilateralism has been the nature in which politics have been advanced in this region. And the environment doesn't take well to unilateralism because in our part of the world, the environment doesn't know borders. Most of our water resources are shared. The Jordan River system is shared between 5 different countries: Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine. And if we're going to manage that water body that is increasingly being decreased in its water availability, then we're going to have to do that together, because otherwise it's a increasingly zero-sum game where no one has enough to sustain themselves. And as we see in the in the outbreak of the pandemic of COVID-19 today, it doesn't really matter how well our health system is or how well our population are maintaining closures. If our neighbor, and in this case, Palestinians in the West Bank in particular, who are so intertwined in our economy and are so intertwined in the economy of Jordan, if we are not acting together, then the ability of one to reduce the pandemic really doesn't count. If the rest of the population that we live with within the same ecosystem, within these same borders, aren't doing the same. So cooperation is not a privilege on these issues, not on the climate crisis, not on water scarcity, not on COVID. It's of absolute necessity. And that's the strength of our work. The strength of our work is that we're able to come Jordanians to Jordanian decision makers, Palestinians to Palestinian decision makers, Israeli to Israeli decision makers, that this is an issue of our national interest as Palestinians, as Jordanians, as Israelis. The failure of each one of us to work together to meet the challenge means the failure of all of us together. We're in the same boat. Either we sail forward or we sink. And that's the strength of our message that people are starting to understand.
Okay, so what I want to actually challenge, not you, but Gilad, in the question that you asked before. Yeah, because the idea that when you said governments may have more urgent fish to fry, I think that's a classic way to think about it. Certainly how I've thought about it for many years. I admit
how governments think about it.
Yeah, I think we're all trying to change our mindset. But Gidon, in a couple of ways, I think that your material challenges it. For example, in one of your analyses of climate change, you back about a year ago, you linked it with all sorts of destructive impacts on the region, including an increase in respiratory diseases. This is a year before anybody ever heard of COVID. But you also talk about it as a matter of human security. And that's the kind of thing that both of those kinds of things are obviously a very urgent priority to governments. How do you kind of make this an urgent priority and tie it into these very urgent things? I mean, in the way now that I've read your material seems obvious to me, but how do you counter that attitude? This region has always seemed kind of behind on enlightened thinking, such as dealing with environmental issues like water and climate change.
We are behind, but on a few issues, we are world leaders. And in this case, particularly, Israel is a world leader in its development of its water economy, of its water sector. And Israel has long understood that water is a national security issue. So we speak to that understanding that water is a national security issue. Let me give you an example. The collapse of water and sanitation infrastructure in Gaza was seen as, by Israeli officials as their problem. Well, we really researched and tried to think deeply. Well, how do we help understand? How do we help Israeli government officials and the broader public understand that a collapse in water and sanitation infrastructure in Gaza is not only a Palestinian problem, but an Israeli, Egyptian, and even a Jordanian problem? And what we did is we started testing the beaches of Israel just north of Gaza. And what we discovered was that the sewage, which we knew was being released from Gaza because of the lack of the ability to build sewage treatment plants, the closure that wouldn't allow cement to go in, electricity only being supplied 4 to 8 hours a day. All that meant was that hundreds of millions of liters of raw sewage would be released every day from Gaza into the Mediterranean. And what we documented and then made public was that sewage is being carried by the currents along the Mediterranean Sea and brought not only to Gaza's beaches, but to Israel's beaches. And the critical water security point that we brought home was that we made public that one of Israel's 5 desalination plants. Israel is the world leader in reverse osmosis desalination. The desalination plant in Ashkelon, 7 kilometers north of Gaza, was getting shut down intermittently. It had to close down its system because you don't want to desalinate polluted water. You don't want to desalinate the sewage water of Gaza as your drinking source from a public health perspective. And the intermittent closure of Ashkelon, which in itself today supplies 15% of Israel's drinking water, really brought home the message to Israeli government decision makers, to Steinitz, the Minister of Energy and Water, but also to Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, highlighting that this is a national security issue for Israel, that the narrow analysis of security being only a military issue is not good enough. If raw sewage flowing across borders means that 15% of your water supply is at risk, and in fact, we later were able to release information that the second desalination plant in Ashkelon is also at risk of receiving sewage from Gaza. That would be 30% of our drinking water today is at risk because of the crisis taking place a few kilometers further south.
Well, what about the Palestinian perspective? I'm asking because, this cross-border sort of, mentality is perhaps fitting for a more auspicious political climate. Your organization started in the 90s, which was just the right time for it. But right now, when we're looking at, the acrimonies between Israel and the Palestinian Authority on the one hand and Hamas on the other.
Soon to be Jordan if Israel continues with annexation.
Exactly. There could be, it's just, I'm assuming it's replicating in many ways the power relations between the countries. And, one aspect of that is perhaps a pushback is anti-normalization. Does it ever come up in the context of environmental issues, or is it just a privilege of, cultural issues, etc.? Is there anyone on the Palestinian side telling you, no, we're not going to cooperate with Israel because it's normalization?
Oh, all the time. So our Palestinian staff, our Jordanian staff are very often condemned as traitors, as we are in the Israeli office. We also get some very ugly emails telling us that because we work with Palestinians and Jordanians, we somehow must be traitors to our national perspectives. But the strength of our work is that we're able to counter that. We're able to respond to that, not only for ourselves, but in all of our work, because EcoPeace is very active on the ground in Israeli communities, working in schools in Israel, in Jordan, in Palestine, working with Palestinian, Jordanian, Israeli mayors, very much on the ground. And we empower everyone that we work with to be able to defend themselves. Because if people can't stand up and respond to that attack of cooperating with the enemy, then the value of our work is really diminished.
Is it a little
However,
bit easier to do that, though, given that you're working on such, sort of urgent, vital infrastructural issues? I mean, one could theoretically say, well, it's all well and good to boycott when it's over academia or culture, things.
Yeah, we don't have the privilege to boycott.
Right. Do you ever benefit from the sense that we work on these things like water? There's nothing more basic.
Absolutely, we come and bring that home. We come and bring that point home. And the strength of that, it's Palestinians coming and saying to other Palestinians who condemn on normalization by saying, well, what do you mean? I mean, if we don't work together on these issues, we won't have any water. When you turn on the tap, there's already a great shortage, and in the future there'll be none. And similarly, with Jordanians, or on the issue of sanitation with Israelis. So, the strength of our work is that this is a crisis issue. This is an issue that really impacts every aspect of our lives.
And when you talk about anti-normalization, we usually think about civil society and individuals. But what about governments? I mean, to change policy, you have to work with decision makers, as you mentioned in the beginning. And I have to tell you that I never really thought of Hamas as an organization with a responsible and enlightened environmental policy or renewable energy strategy. How do you make that what's the situation in Gaza? How do you make those kinds of changes when it comes to the policymakers? And how do you deal with the Israelis and trying to get them to coordinate some sort of policy with the de facto authorities in Gaza?
So firstly, we don't play the blame game. We're not about, pointing the finger and saying, you know what, you're responsible, you're solely responsible, and you need to fix the situation. We come and say, no, there is a crisis here, and every side must take responsibility. We're coming and saying, to Israelis, to Israeli decision makers, what we expect you to do in order to take responsibility and improve the situation. And similarly, from our Palestinian office to the Palestinian Authority, to the international community together, that's another aspect of our strength, that we're Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian together coming to the international community. So in the case of Gaza and the water crisis impacting the broader region, we didn't play a blame game. We came and said, look, Ashkelon is intermittently closing, and the policy not to allow cement into Gaza is partially responsible for that. So common sense, we're calling on the government of Israel to change that policy, to remove cement as a dual-use issue, unless Israel doesn't care that 15% of its water supply is at risk. And clearly, the response was actually very positive. And both the Prime Minister and the Minister of Energy and Water responded by saying, well, if this is a national security issue to Israel, then allowing cement to more freely flow into Gaza becomes a security issue for Israel.
Allows the water to flow more freely in Israel.
But I think that's the key issue, that when you highlight the self-interest, we're 100 years of conflict here. There's no nice guys, on any side. On any side. That's how we're 25 years operating together. There are no nice guys in this region. People are operating because they're identifying and advancing their self-interest. The role of EcoPeace is to speak to that self-interest, but in a manner that produces mutual gain. So that we're not advancing any type of self-interest of Israel. We're looking at the self-interest of Israel that also advances the self-interest of Palestine and Jordan. And in our work of our shared environment, that because of the nature of the work itself, that is somewhat easier to do because you can't disengage from a shared environment. I mean, the politicians tell us that, you can build a wall and forget about the other side. That's what we did around Gaza. That's what the separation barrier has done with the West Bank. But when there's a strong flood, the wall falls. The power of nature is stronger than the walls that we build. The COVID-19 doesn't recognize any of these borders. So there's something essential in the very issue of our work that people do understand.
So maybe you can illustrate that, Gidon, with the example that I found very interesting of the water energy nexus, which is a trilateral Israeli-Palestinian Jordanian plan to combat water and energy scarcity in all three countries. Can you explain how it came about and where does it stand now in terms of actually transitioning into policy?
And I just want to contextualize that. To my mind, this was like the opening of the horizon after we've identified such a deep problem in the region. I think your report about that project, it was like, here's the direction of hope for what these societies could do together. Do you see it like that?
Oh, absolutely. So again, very much the focus of EcoPeace is not just to identify the problem, but to try and find the solution. And and the problems are clear. We're in a tremendous water crisis. When we talk about climate change, we need to understand that part of the uprising in Syria is due to the climate crisis.
Going back to that point about sometimes governments have higher priorities, but this is so deeply linked to those higher priorities.
Completely, and then the cross-border implications of that mean that over 1 million refugees, some figures will say 2 million Syrian refugees crossed to Jordan. Amman, the capital, before the refugee crisis, never had 24/7 water supply, but people were receiving water in their homes 2 days a week. Subsequent to the Syrian crisis, people are receiving water 8 hours a week. That's a tremendous cut in water supply. That threatens the national security of Jordan as a viable country, having so little water supply for its residents. So in this picture of where the region it was already tremendously water scarce, but now with climate change and conflict even further impacted, well, we really thought deeply, how can we turn things around? And in a very practical way, we looked at what is the technology that is currently being deployed in the region that allows us to look forward. And on the one hand, Israel is a world leader in the building of desalination plants and the development of reverse osmosis technology for desalination. We've seen a dramatic drop in the cost of desalination.
So shouldn't that solve all the problems?
It doesn't solve all the problems, but it's part of the answer. The cost of desalination was $2 a cubic meter a decade ago. With reverse osmosis technology, it's down to 50 cents. Now, to pump water from an aquifer also takes electricity. It can be more expensive to pump natural water from a deep well than to desalinate on the Mediterranean. And the advantage of desalinating on the Mediterranean is that all of our populations, Israeli, Palestinian, and Jordanian, are no more than 100 kilometers from the Mediterranean. So both Israelis and Palestinians, along the Israeli coast and then the Gaza coast for Palestinians, have the comparative advantage, they both have it, to desalinate and move water across the region at cheapest prices. Now, Jordan too has a sea, it's the Gulf of Aqaba, but that's 300 kilometers from Amman. It's 400 kilometers from Irbid. That's 3 times the price, or 4 times the price if you need to go all the way to Irbid. And that means that desalination on the Mediterranean is the much more viable economic option. On the other hand, Jordan has the vast desert area and the comparative advantage, and much due to China's entry into the solar energy market. Since China started to become a major producer of photovoltaic cells, then here too, the drop in price of producing green energy has plummeted to our regional advantage. So, the cost of electricity in Israel is 10, 11 cents a kilowatt hour. In Jordan, through harnessing the sun, they're able to produce electricity at 3 cents a kilowatt hour.
So Jordan has more capacity to create solar energy. Israel has more capacity to create desalination. Where's the nexus?
So the nexus is for Jordan to produce green electricity not only for itself but to export it to Israel and Palestine. We then use that part of that electricity to desalinate on the Mediterranean, and then we move the desalinated water back to Jordan for ourselves, but also for Jordan. So we create really what Europe, and you'd mentioned that Germany supports this effort. Well, Germany and France, after for hundreds of years were at each other's necks.
At each other's necks would be an understatement.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the amount of murder and destruction in that continent. Who would have believed that after World War II, Germany and France would lead an agreement based on coal and steel to create healthy interdependencies that in fact led to the European Union? Well, at EcoPeace, we thought deeply: what is the coal and steel of this century, and relevant to the Levant? And given the development of technology, it's the harnessing of the sun and the harnessing of the sea, and the ability to create interdependencies where each side, some people will come and say, well, Israel can go alone. Israel can simply desalinate and has the Negev, and it can also, therefore produce the electricity. So it doesn't need anyone else. Well, firstly, it's not true because the Negev is captured. But secondly,
the Negev is captured? What does that mean?
Half the Negev is taken by the Israeli military for training grounds, and the other half are declared nature reserves. So the reason that Israel is still under 9% of its electricity with renewables is because there's a tremendous challenge to get land to build solar farms. On the other hand, Jordan has this vast territory where it's cheaper and available and within 100 kilometers of the populations of Jordan, Palestine, and Israel, as we said earlier. So we're trying to create a system here by design that creates healthy interdependency. It doesn't mean that all of our electricity will come from Jordan, but if a portion of our electricity, if we buy a portion of our electricity from Jordan, that creates a revenue stream for Jordan to be able to buy water from us.
Sounds a lot better than the American military aid that pumps money into Israel so that Israel can buy back American arms. I mean, in that sense, this is like a sort of healthy replacement for security in the traditional sense.
Completely, because should the crisis of water continue in Jordan, but not only in Jordan, but in Palestine, in the West Bank, and Gaza, people in Gaza are drinking from jerry cans. They can't drink the groundwater anymore. They're having to fill jerry cans from desalination plants and carry that water home like it was the Middle Ages. Why are we so fearful of COVID breaking out in Gaza? It's partly because the water and sanitation infrastructure doesn't allow people to properly wash their hands. You're talking about 20 seconds of hand washing. You got to be joking. There's no water in Gaza that will enable you to wash your hands for 20 seconds. So it brings home, COVID does bring home the message to the security establishment that the water insecurity of Jordan, of Gaza and the West Bank is a national security threat.
Right. And that nexus is becoming
Israel.
clearer and clearer, considering that in Israel, the Minister of Defense has been working very hard to get to be allowed to manage the entire COVID crisis. So that's sort of that's a nexus in itself between security and this environmental issue.
Yeah, so maybe get on the water energy nexus. Can you tell us how far along is it in becoming actual policy?
So of course, that is the great challenge, and the greatest challenge has been that there hasn't been a government of Israel. I mean, we've had a caretaker government for more than a year.
Coming on a year and a half, in case you were really wondering.
Right. And therefore, there's been an inability of the government of Israel to come and make a public decision in support, particularly of the water, of the energy ministry, to buy electricity. Israel has been an electricity island. It's never been able to buy electricity from any of her neighbors. And this is the first opportunity that this could happen. Steinitz has expressed interest. The Minister of Regional Cooperation has actually written a letter of support, or the Ministry of Regional Cooperation in Israel has publicly come out and said it's in favor of further investigating, particularly a pilot program of building a pilot solar facility in Jordan that would, for the very first time, sell electricity across the border. So on the one hand, we're waiting for a government of Israel that will be empowered to change policy that will enable buying electricity from Jordan, given that we know that even this current government and certainly the bureaucracy are extremely interested. Israel is not meeting its Paris climate commitments. Steinitz has come out and said that the real target for Israel is now 25 or 30% of the electricity coming from solar, and we're still stuck at 9. And we're not going to get there unless we think out of the box, and looking at Jordan is part of that thinking.
And what about the Jordanian government and the Palestinian Authority?
So all three governments have participated in events, in conferences with us, proactively on this issue. In fact, we even had a delegation of representatives of the Palestinian Water Authority, the Renewable Energy Authority in Jordan, and the government of Israel going to Brussels and Berlin, speaking positively, specifically about the water energy nexus, that they're in favor of moving from a pre-feasibility study that EcoPeace completed to a full feasibility study and a pilot to show viability. So when self-interests combine to mutual gain, yes, that's what we see moving forward. And it's not just on the water energy nexus. We see it. We see some progress in the Jordan Valley. We see some progress, not enough, on water and sanitation infrastructure in Gaza. When we started our work in Gaza 5 years ago, there was no modern sewage treatment plant. Today, there are 3 modern sewage treatment plants operating in Gaza. They're not operating out of generosity. They're operating because there is a clear understanding, be it in Israel, be it in Ramallah, be it in Gaza itself and the international community, that the failure to cooperate on this issue is at everyone's risk.
Okay, now you mentioned before about thinking outside the box, and I want to take you a bit outside the region. You also talked about the birth of the EU, and and the Paris Agreement. We have lots of pieces coming together that I want to bring together to ask you about the role of the international community. As we know, this is a global issue. As you just mentioned, the international community has an interest in helping to promote this too. What is that international community, and how can it or they best promote this, or have been? How have they been?
So through the government of Germany, we in fact received the financial support from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung to actually do the pre-feasibility study. Sweden has been a prominent supporter of this effort. Sweden globally has identified transboundary water issues, not only in the Middle East, but around the world, as really important points of intervention, of thinking out of the box, of trying to compel warring parties to understand that there's some basic common interests here.
So they've worked in other situations of conflict where there are cross-border environmental issues that need to cut through a political blockage?
So there are many examples. So Pakistan and India operate a joint water commission that was established with World Bank support throughout the different wars between Pakistan and India. That water commission never stopped working on various river basins across Africa and Asia. You see a high level of cooperation being maintained over water issues. The difference in the work of EcoPeace here in the region is that we're not only focused on the top down, on the governments, we have very much focused equally on the bottom up, on the community based. And that's been the secret to our success. So in order to help change the policies of the government of Israel in relation to cement going into Gaza, one of our biggest supporters were the Israeli mayors around Gaza, be they left wing or right wing. All of the mayors of the communities on the Israeli side of the Gaza envelope signed a common letter to the Israeli Prime Minister and to then Minister of Defense that we've been at the front line of rockets, of tunnels. Don't place us on the front line of pandemic disease. These were their words. And they were fearful that the crisis of water and sanitation in Gaza would lead to pandemic disease outbreak in Gaza that wouldn't stop in Gaza.
Yeah, so these are people who are not exactly radical left-wingers, but they're saying you need to address this so that we don't end up suffering as a result.
Exactly. And it's remarkable. I mean, we raised this issue and, we've been interviewed heavily on COVID-19 because we started speaking about these issues 3, 4, 5 years ago, that this is a ticking time bomb. We're today seeing where the bomb has exploded. The question is, are we learning? Are we truly changing our mindset? And unfortunately, we still don't see it with our political our leadership, and therefore the work of EcoPeace, is more important and pertinent today than ever before.
Let me ask you, we have to end pretty soon, but I want to ask you about as you pointed out, the leadership is so important ultimately in changing policy. If you had to imagine the kind of ideal conflict resolution scenario for Israelis and Palestinians purely through the filter of the best way to drive the needed changes in a common environmental policy to address these very urgent issues, you've certainly convinced us, not that anybody should need convincing at this point. What should it be? I mean, okay, proper disclosure, you and I have discussed this, but I'm curious to hear, your perspective. You are called EcoPeace. There's a peace in there somewhere. What would it look like to have the perfect kind of resolution form, agreement that would be most conducive to the kinds of environmental policy that you'd like to see?
So first and foremost, we need to stop holding water issues hostage to the broader political issues. So water is one of the 5 final status issues of the Oslo Accord. Now, in 94, 95, when Oslo was being negotiated, water was a zero-sum game. There was only natural water, and sharing it fairly would have produced winners and losers, and it would have meant less water predominantly for Israeli farmers. And therefore, water was put aside together with Jerusalem and settlements and security and so forth in order to strike a deal. Solving water 25 years ago was indeed a hard thing to do. The tragedy, on the positive side, that's not the reality today. Because of, in this case, it is Israel's leadership in both desalination and in treating wastewater. So half the food that we grow in Israel today is grown on treated wastewater. 87% of our wastewater is treated and reused for agriculture. 87%. The next country in the world is Spain at 26%. The United States is under 2%. That's how ahead we are from the rest of the world. The advantage is that the water pie has expanded tremendously. Today, we can share water fairly because we don't share water fairly at present, the natural water, with our Palestinian neighbors. of the shared water under Oslo interim accords, we take 75%. The Palestinians only get 25%. Now, the parties are going to have to negotiate whether it's going to be a 50-50 or 60-40 divide. But at the moment, they're not willing to move forward because the mindset, and in this case, it's the same mindset in Ramallah, Jerusalem, or internationally, that either we agree on everything or we agree on nothing. And for 25 years, we've failed to agree on everything, and therefore we've been left with nothing. It's no wonder that our publics have no faith, not on the Israeli side, not on the Palestinian side, that anything will ever get better, because the paradigm has actually created a crazy system where, if we don't agree on everything, we don't agree, we can't advance.
Okay, so you talked about a way that the process for getting there should change in terms of what order the negotiations should take. We should not leave this for final status issues. What about the ultimate vision of how to resolve the conflict, or do you take a position on that?
Oh, absolutely. So in 2012, we even prepared a document on our website on what a water agreement could look like between Israelis and Palestinians. And that water agreement, first and foremost, solves the fair allocation of the natural water. And that becomes an easy thing to do because, we can now manufacture water, sometimes at cheaper prices than pumping natural water out of a deep well. And in that framework, then we have lots of room for cooperation. At EcoPeace, we see the creation of a joint water commission. It's actual, common policy. The United States and Mexico have an international boundary water commission. The United States and Canada have a joint international water commission. All major river basins in Europe, the Rhine, the Rhone, the water resources can only be managed sustainably if they're managed together. So we need to create the governance structure, is to have a joint water commission. In fact, at EcoPeace, we think it needs to be beyond just Israel-Palestine. Our water basins are also shared with Jordan. The Jordan River is clearly shared also with. So there are levels of trilateral governance.
So a joint Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian trilateral council for water as a model for future governments?
Absolutely, as a model to manage sustainably our water resources, not only in water supply, but also in sewage treatment and preventing pollution, which at the moment is rampant, and then in investing in technologies across the board to sustain ourselves, to meet the climate crisis that we all face. And if we don't, if such a governance system doesn't come to play, then again it brings home, the message that the failure of our neighbor becomes the failure of ourselves. We must lift our head out of the sand. When Syria collapses, it threatens Jordan's stability. If Jordan is further impacted from climate change, impacted by climate change for its water security, there are ramifications.
Right. Well, I think we have. You've certainly convinced us of the need for healthy interdependence, emphasis on health. Gidon Bromberg of EcoPeace, thank you so much for being on the show.
A real pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And many thanks to Itai Shalem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. And of course, thank you again to the German government for sponsoring this special series on Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries. And now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. And if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And of course, don't forget to follow Dalia and me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.